Welcome to Momentum Mode. My name is Mike Shannon, and alongside my co-host Corey Farringle, this episode will feature an interview with Dan Dal Degan, aka Triple D. Dan is a seasoned SaaS leader, investor, advisor. He's on countless boards of directors and chairmen, and has played a key role in scaling and exiting some of the biggest names in enterprise software. He played an early role at Salesforce, so pivotal that he was personally thanked by CEO Mark Benioff in his autobiography. We cover a range of topics with Dan, including growing and leading high-performance sales teams, scaling companies through major acquisitions, and the evolution of leadership in fast-growing organizations. Before we jump in, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Kilpatrick, Townsend & Stockton, an innovation-focused law firm with 22 offices around the world, including right here in Chicago. We've worked with our partners at Kilpatrick for a long time, including on issues related to M&A transactions and scaling software-as-a-service businesses, both of which Dan Dal Degan knows a thing or two about. So let's dive in. Dan Dal Degan, Triple D, thanks for joining again.
Great to be here, Mike and Corey.
Okay, there's a quote that we all love, and I'm sure much of the audience loves. Culture eats strategy for lunch. Okay, but strategy still exists. So we're going to shine some light.
It might be important.
Right. We're going to shine
Right.
some light on strategy and tactics and open up the toolbox with Triple D. So, Dan, when you hear that in the strategy side of it, what's coming first to your mind?
Well, first of all, with giving due respect to culture, we've put a lot of time and energy into culture by necessity through the COVID generation.
Sure.
Yeah. And we've had to rethink what does it even mean and how do employees feel some sense of involvement in it and ownership of it. Great. We need to do the same thing with strategy.
Mhm.
And strategy, I think, to a lot of employees and individual contributors in our organizations feels like a bit of an unapproachable ivory tower concept that's better left to, the senior leadership in the company. But I feel like if that's what it is in a company, that means it's poorly defined
Yep.
and certainly poorly communicated. Because I think in an ideal world, which none of us have ever lived in, right?
Right.
But we should be able in any organization that we're a leader in, be able to engage anybody in the hallway back when we were in the office all the time,
Yes.
right? And have an intelligent conversation with them about strategy. Not that you'd stop them and say, quick, pop quiz, what's our
Right.
strategy? I mean, that'd be a little intimidating from the CEO,
Yeah.
right? But it might be good payback for the fact that everybody stops you on the way to the bathroom, right? So you start doing that to them. But if you did that, I'd say 80% of your employees should be able to give you a reasonably cogent articulation of what is the strategy. And if they can't do that, that's on the CEO. That means
Yeah.
you need to rethink, if not the strategy itself, how do you communicate it to the team in a way that actually impacts what they prioritize every day?
Yeah.
And to me, if that's not what strategy is, then it's not serving the
Right.
organization.
Right.
I always talk with the boards I'm on. I look at the CEO and I'm like, how is a person at their desk going to make a decision on prioritizing their time by looking at your goals for the year? Can
Great
they
question.
do it?
Right.
Right. And I don't think any of us will be shocked how many companies can't do
That's
that.
right.
Right.
Indeed.
Okay, so Dan, let's get tactical on that. There's a lot of frameworks out there. Objectives and key results is one popular one.
Mhm.
Walk us into your executive team meeting. What are you actually doing to define strategy, and what type of format or method do you use?
Sure. So it's very literal and intentional in the world I operate in now, which is in private equity. As an investor and operating partner, advising and serving the boards of companies who we will invest in and do usually a controlling interest investment, typically with an ownership period of 5 to 7 years,
Mhm.
with a very specific objective, and the outcome is we want to get a multiple on our invested capital of something, a really nice multiple of 3 or more, let's say, right? And what we consider good, just like valuation multiples, vary based on economic conditions. So somebody might watch this, 5 years from now and go,
Yeah.
3x?
Whoa,
were they modest?
I get
Yeah.
6 times my
Yeah.
money now. Yeah. Right.
Right. So whatever the objective is, du jour, to me, strategy is how are we going to navigate that journey together in a way that everybody who we need on board, so to speak, feels like they personally win in it with
Yep.
us. And that's not an easy thing to achieve as you look at all the different interests and roles across an organization. And let's just take a software company, which is where we have that shared real estate in our lives. That could be engineering, product. It could be marketing, operations, G&A, certainly sales, customer success. Every one of us in those areas, every leader of those respective teams should be marching per that strategy towards some outcomes that are measurable. So you mentioned OKRs. That's a great way to keep score on an incremental basis. It's a bit like the analogy I use when I'm talking about strategy with the teams I serve is strategy to me, if it's properly reflected in the way we're conducting our days and making decisions how we're going to spend our time, it should be like let's just take an NFL game. The scoreboard's going to show us the score, the time remaining in the quarter, what quarter it is. But if you're watching at home, you get all these other analytics on, okay, time of possession. And that's why when you're watching a game in the stadium, you're sometimes either looking at your phone or you're thirsty for all that other data because we're used to getting inundated with it viewing at home. Sure. But in business, what the reason that hits a sweet tooth for us and we get a dopamine hit from that is because it's showing us what's the incremental progress that we're really tracking that's likely to tell us who at the end of the game is going to win.
Yep.
Right. Time of possession, turnovers. Right. If you tell me those two stats of any NFL game and you don't show me the final score, all of us could probably guess with 90+% accuracy who won the game. Right. So those incremental day-to-day, week-to-week actions that we're going to keep track of.
Yep.
If we pick the right ones, it's going to lead to the outcomes we want.
Right.
And here's an example. Strategy is not we're going to be 20% EBITDA and 37% growth. That's not a strategy.
Right.
That's an outcome.
EBITDA, yeah.
Right.
So how do you pick the right ones then? How do you pick the right indicators that lead to that great earnings and great revenue growth, right? How do you go about it? Because we've all been in the organization where you're like, but we hit all of our key metrics.
Right.
Oh, but the numbers weren't there for the year, right?
Right.
How do you pick the right ones?
It's a great question, but I think it's in those cases where that happens and you hit the OKRs, but you miss, win the battle, lose the war, is we chose the wrong ones. We weren't either granular enough in how we define them. Yep. We weren't ambitious enough in what threshold should be established that we're shooting for, or we just entirely picked the wrong ones. And an example in customer success, I see this a lot in software companies, is let's measure adoption. Oh, okay. What's adoption of our product? Well, average daily users is a measure. At Salesforce, believe it or not, we measured adoption in logins, and you double clicked on it, peeled it back. Is it if a rep logged in at least once every 2 weeks into Salesforce, we considered them adopted? Like, okay, come on. That was such a low threshold.
That's because their manager yelled at them. They had to enter some data and they walked out.
Logged in. Yeah. I mean, come on. So if in that, you're probably not going to find consistent connections between that stat and any kind of meaningful outcome because it's completely arbitrary.
Right.
And we didn't set the bar high enough. So I think when you design them thoughtfully, and I think the best way to do that is to consult the teams who are actually on the ground driving those activities every day on what are you doing that leads to success? What do you think a good stretch goal for this is? Let's say, back to customer success, instead of just measuring adoption of the users, which is light, let's say we're going to measure, have they taken and completed the training? Online training and both, whether it's internal or for our customer users, you could be measuring how often are they logging tickets in support. Okay, important. What's our response time? What's our average resolution time on tickets? Yep. Those are examples of things that you can. The Venn diagram is pretty predictable. Okay, that's going to result in either attrition, or retention and renewal of that customer, and it shouldn't be a surprise by the end.
How do you get to the point though where people naturally like to set goals that are very attainable? Mm-hmm. And they like to target metrics that they kind of already understand, right? And what you're saying is, I'm actually creating a third metric, but it's a combination of these three things that make the Venn diagram. What we care about is the center of that, right? How do you drive the team to critically think about that, to move out of their comfort zone of the metrics they know, or be comfortable with a stretch goal and not be like, this jerk is just setting me up to fail, right? Yeah,
it's probably as much art as it is science, Corey, that part of it, I think, stems from the trust the team's going to have in you as a leader and vice versa, that there's got to be an open dialogue, I think, with a certain amount of trust that I'm going to trust you to tell me based on your day-to-day experience with customers, with writing code, with filling the opportunity funnel, whatever your role is. I'm going to have to show some trust in you that you're going to inform me based on what's really happened in the business today.
Yep.
To shape an idea of what's a reasonable threshold to set for this goal. You've got to then trust me that I'm not going to just say, all right, your goal is X and your goal is X, but we're going to overassign the numbers so aggressively from top to bottom.
Right.
And that overassignment's a reality. We typically overassign plans, 15 to 25% in that range. But if some organizations set up an overassign, let's just say on bookings objectives for revenue, that is like 50%.
Yeah.
Then you're basically gaming the system and telling everybody else, you're probably not going to be successful individually, but we as a leadership team are going to be wildly successful.
Because we're destroying.
So how do you compromise
that erodes the trust.
Right.
Yeah. So then what's the compromise between not wanting that trust erosion to occur, but also perhaps wanting to set stretch goals and targets for the company? How do you find that balance?
I think one of them, and I've done this sometimes to the dismay or surprise of others on the leadership team. We always talk about it before. I try not to surprise them with it, but I'll talk openly about overassignment.
Yep.
Okay.
In the rank and file conversations. I think everybody in the organization, to get to that level of trust, part of it is educating the team on phrases that they might not be familiar with, that probably in an all-hands meeting, nobody's going to be courageous enough to go, excuse me, Corey, what is EBITDA?
Or how about overassignment? What does
even
why don't
that
you
mean?
go ahead and explain that?
Sure.
Because I'm sure some of our listeners don't know.
Great point. So if you have a company, let's just take revenue as a frequently obsessed over metric.
Yes.
Bookings that leads to revenue. So our bookings growth, how much value are our customers signing up for on a contractual basis, on a dollar basis in a given quarter, let's say. So let's say for that quarter, our objective is $10 million in new bookings. The company's objective, $10 million. That's going to get us to our growth and EBITDA objectives. It's part of our budget for which all the hiring we're doing. That means we're on plan. We do 10 million. Well, if the company's goal is 10 million, the assignment of quotas in the aggregate is probably going to be 11.5 million.
Yep.
To give us some buffer. Why? People quit and leave, and you have to backfill the role.
Yep.
People take vacations.
Yep.
Not everybody is engaged 24/7 in every role, and you got to have some margin of error built into a plan to achieve a bookings objective. And the other important measures in every company are similarly structured. Revenue is the one we obsess the most over, obviously. So that's an example of overassignment. And when you explain that to teams, there's a logical, you can almost see them sitting back in their chair and go, there's nothing devious about that. And there's trust.
Yeah.
And when you take the time to define, here's what we mean by growth. Revenue this year, revenue last year. Are we growing? Everybody likes to invest in growing companies, growing industries. EBITDA, what does it stand for? Earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation and amortization, I think. Yeah. Taking accounting a long time. And I roll over EBITDA. That's the way to say it in Chicago. It's EBITDA.
EBITDA.
Right. But that can alienate an audience.
Right.
If you talk in that kind of speak and fly by it, then the audience just tunes you out like, I don't get any of this. I don't think this is relevant to me. I'm not going to get inspired by this. I'm not going to feel informed. But when you take the time in a way that's not condescending and you're not just mansplaining it to everybody and you are candid, it's like, we're not. And here's the thing to keep in mind. Of all the companies, commercial organizations, all three of us have worked for, we're not curing cancer.
Right.
We're not solving for peace in the Middle East or world hunger.
Right.
So let's keep this in perspective. So I think having a somewhat self-deprecating sense of humor about the folly, the occasional folly in what we do, is important to keep in mind. And I think customers and partners, as well as employees, gravitate to leaders whose style is to take the mission very seriously, but not take yourself too seriously.
Yeah. One thing my CFO and I would try to do is we would create almost like games in these workshops.
Love it.
Whether it was on a retreat or a financial town hall, to just kind of break down some of those concepts that, EBITDA, somebody's not talking about every day in their sales manager role. Have you found any methods of bringing the shared language across the whole company without mansplaining it that you found have worked for you and your organizations?
Yes. I think having Pied Pipers in each organization who have the respect of their teammates. And it's an interesting dynamic. It's not always, in fact, especially in engineering teams, it's very rarely based on positional authority, like manager versus individual contributor. It's based on reputational authority. So the people in each team, there's somebody in sales, usually a few people, the bigger the company, the more of them there are, in product and engineering and finance, who are the ones that everybody kind of looks to, well, I don't know how to feel about this. How's Corey feel?
Yeah.
His vibe seems to be he's accepting and he's nodding his head, okay. I'm comfortable. But if I see you going, now I'm uncomfortable because I trust your perception. I don't even know what language we're speaking, but I'm just gauging your reaction. So if you find out who those people are in the key areas and you enlist them, you enroll them in the agenda and say, look, I'm looking to you to help us make this message, this plan, this whatever it is you're trying to sell to the team. And that's the other element of a CEO's job. Whether we came from sales or not, we're always selling. And primarily your internal team on getting behind a plan. Because a lot of times, the teams, I find as a CEO, you got to get really good at figuring out, is the team just nodding their heads and like they don't understand it or they don't buy into it? Both are bad. But they're nodding their heads because they don't want to be the one to raise their hand and say, I'm sorry, I don't get it. which might be perceived as akin to saying you don't know what you're doing and
Right.
you're losing me.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody wants to call that out in a group setting, but you need to be, it's just like an artist, a comedian or a musician needs to know how to read the audience.
Yeah.
And in comedy, it's real obvious.
Right.
You can either get crickets or great laughter. Right.
Right.
And so you gotta know when that's happening and take another run at it. Like,
Yeah.
okay, that didn't land. Let me try again.
Yeah.
And if an audience sees you making that
self-awareness
effort,
as a communicator.
yes.
Is this happening once a year, that type of setting, or every
Usually
week in an
quarterly.
all hands quarterly? Okay.
I like to do our all hands meetings generally quarterly.
Okay.
To make sure that employees feel like they're getting frequent enough touch points with
Okay.
executive leadership. It's a bit, some of it's kind of a State of the Union address,
Sure.
but it should also be Q&A interactive in a way for the team to feel like, okay, it's not just the message and it's not
Yeah.
the syntax.
Yeah.
It's what's the body language of all the executives.
Yeah.
What's the body language of the key thought leaders in the audience who I respect the most? And
Yep.
back to, is Corey responding?
Yeah.
Like, has he seemed into this, or does he seem alienated by it or pissed off by
Yeah.
it, or is
Yeah.
he not getting it? And
Did
if
that
you do that well,
cadence evolve through Salesforce, to go back a little bit? So you were pre-IPO, first 100 employees?
I was employee 85 at Salesforce. Yeah.
Okay. So
Back in
then
the
you
early
went
days.
through IPO and
Mhm.
obviously a decade of growth. Did those cadences and methods evolve, and how did they evolve?
Probably the best manifestation I saw of this that I learned the most from was at Salesforce.
Okay.
And Mark Benioff, among the many things that he does as a genius, communications with and the inspiration of employees.
Mm-hmm.
He's probably without peer of any of the CEOs I've worked
Interesting.
with, because he knows how to get an audience, and in this case, a very fast-growing audience of internal employees, but also the audience at Dreamforce, which is partners and customers and other members of the ecosystem. He's got an ability to do what we're talking about here, which is not just deliver a message in a way that is inspiring and is going to get people fired up, and also that has an element of humor and very intentionally self-deprecating humor in it. We would always poke fun at ourselves while we were very aggressively chasing these very opportunistic, grandiose growth plans and profitability plans. Early days, all growth. Later days, profitability started to matter.
How it usually goes, yeah.
Exactly. But he was really good at getting, again, the right stakeholders to be enrolled.
Yep.
So that if you get the right people in the audience going, hell yeah.
Right.
Including the meetings that happen after that,
Right.
reinforcing the message.
Yeah.
That's what turns what might otherwise be an uninspiring town hall meeting on a quarterly basis turn into a really good one.
It's fascinating. We're talking about strategy and goals and such, and it's coming back to trust and communication as the foundational elements, right?
That's right.
And to some degree, if you don't have those, it doesn't matter if you set the right metrics, doesn't matter if you set the right strategy. People are going to whatever. They don't know what they're doing.
Exactly. So think of, I love movie analogies. And my age will be reflected in the
There we go.
generation from which I'll pull this one. So in Animal House, when John Belushi was trying to rally his fraternity brothers and saying, was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? And they just go,
Germans?
oh, God. Yeah.
And he let him go. He's on a roll. He's on a roll.
Exactly.
He's on a roll.
And he goes through that inspiring speech. He goes, who's with me?
Yeah.
And he runs out and nobody follows him.
Yeah.
Have we had that experience as leaders before?
Absolutely.
When you think you've nailed it and
Yeah.
everybody's going to be like, yeah, and follow you. And everybody's just sitting there and he goes,
Oh, yeah.
something
Okay.
missed. So I think really transcendent leaders, the ones that are really self-aware and evolved, are the ones that, first of all, won't count on just their speech alone to get everybody up and running out the room with you. It's going to be enrolling other people in that ahead of time, saying, here's what we're going to talk about. Everybody's going to be looking to you to see if you're buying in or not. I need you with me. The lieutenants, if you will, the stakeholders, the thought leaders in an organization. It doesn't relate directly to the org chart.
So how big was Spring when you ran that?
We had about 180 to 200 employees, and we were about 20-ish million in sales.
How did you figure out who those 180 people, you couldn't have a personal relationship with all of them. How do you figure out who those thought leaders are?
It's a great point, because I would ask the leaders of each of those functional areas on the C executive suite team. Some among senior leadership, the 3 or 4 people that are rising stars that you got an eye on, or the 3 or 4 people who are kind of thought leaders everybody looks to, maybe, or mentors or sage opinion leaders. And I'd say about half the time our leaders were right.
Yep.
And about the other half the time, there were people in the organization who were much more influential even than the senior leaders in charge of those functions would realize. And it would start to reveal itself as communication patterns were emerging around the all hands, but also just in weekly forecast calls. So here's an example. In our forecast calls, we started revenue forecasting when you're talking about what are we going to book this week, this month. We would always talk about a win. Everybody wants to talk about a victory. Right? But in sports, how much did you learn after a win? Did the coach really have your attention after a win?
Right.
He or she's really got your attention after a loss, right?
Bears are very attentive right now. Then,
exactly.
Anyway,
that's a really quiet.
Yeah. Plus, the old line, you either win or you learn. You're more likely to do a retrospective after the loss.
Exactly. And that's when the coach has got your attention, especially watching game film. Everybody's like, oh, shit, they're going to see that bad play of mine here. And it's true in business, too. So what we started doing in the forecast calls is celebrating, key choice of verbs there, celebrating a walk away. So we would do a win story and a walk story. And we'd have somebody present a win. What does a walk away mean? A walk away was, all right, Sharon, you had an experience this year with this week with a prospect where you disqualified an opportunity of like $250,000 that you've been pursuing for 9 months. Why did you disqualify that and move that to dead no decision in Salesforce, the deal status? And she would proudly stand up and tell a story about, well, my SE and I, we realized they weren't moving forward with their evaluation on the pace that we set in the mutual plan. We weren't getting access to power. They hadn't confirmed if there's actual budget for this project, and we realized we were wasting our time.
Love it.
And we wanted to liberate ourselves to spend our precious limited time on more qualified opportunities. And the audience would, good for you.
That's
it's
terrific.
liberating. It really drives the message home that the team is not just has license to qualify. There's a mandate. You have to qualify. I'd rather have a $10 million pipeline of highly qualified deals than a $20 million pipeline of bullshit.
Every day.
You're weaving time management into the culture.
That's right.
With the celebration.
And trust by showing it's okay to make these kind of decisions.
Exactly. Not only okay, we're going to celebrate it. You're going to you'll become a folklore star.
Yeah.
Whether you've closed anything that week, we celebrate your decision, your courageous decision. And your SEs and your professional services team members love you as a seller when you qualify well and don't waste their time.
Yeah. Well, we did a one-on-one episode talking about sales planning, and one of the things that just brings those meetings down is all the time sifting through what's nonsense or not. So if you can celebrate, just kick it out, you're saving so much time and then getting to clarity of what's actually in the pipeline.
Right.
So I love that. Wrapping up, I guess.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks, Dan Dal Degan. We opened with the question of does culture eat strategy for lunch? We highlighted strategy, but I think it came back to culture eating it for lunch. So, anyways, Triple D, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Corey.